The lights inside the studio dimmed gently, washing everything in a golden hue as the talk show's iconic theme song played, signaling the return from commercial break. The audience clapped and whistled, some on their feet, some holding signs and phones, waiting, hoping for something extraordinary. But even the most loyal fan couldn't have predicted what was about to unfold. The host smiled with the kind of anticipation that only came when something rare was about to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock. And just like that, the doors parted and they stepped out together, two legends, side by side with the world holding its breath. Keanu, ever humble in black denim and a relaxed blazer, wore that gentle, unreadable expression he was known for. Sandra, in a flowing navy dress that shimmered under the lights, had a quiet strength in her smile, but also a weight behind her eyes. The kind of weight that years couldn't erase. As they settled onto the couch, the crowd's excitement faded into respectful silence. It had been years since they were seen together like this, not on a film set, not on a red carpet, just real. What no one knew was that this moment had taken years to arrive. Decades even, not because they didn't have the opportunity, but because neither had the courage to speak the truth they both buried behind smiles, interviews, and the busy rush of life. They had shared stages before, promotions and reunions and fan-fueled nostalgia. But this was different. This was live. This was raw. This was Sandra asking, no, insisting, that they sit down publicly and say things left unsaid, not for the tabloids. Not for ratings, but because too much time had passed and silence had become heavier than words ever could. She made the call herself. She asked for the spot, not her team, not her agent. Just Sandra dialing a familiar number with shaking fingers asking Keanu, will you come? There's something I need to say to you, on air, no scripts, just us. He had paused for a long time, and then said the only thing he ever needed to, I'll be there. As the host opened the interview with light-hearted questions, laughter filled the air. Stories about filming speed, about pranks on set, about Keanu's quiet gestures and Sandra's chaotic charm. But anyone watching closely could feel the shift. The way Sandra's hands fidgeted slightly in her lap. The way Keanu kept glancing at her, not as an actor would a co-star, but as a man would someone whose absence he still carried. The joke slowed. The audience waited. And then it happened. Sandra leaned forward, eyes soft, voice barely above a whisper. Can I say something real? The host, caught off guard, blinked, then nodded, the camera's focus tighter. Even Keanu sat up, sensing the change. Sandra inhaled deeply, as if summoning years of truth in a single breath. I've lived a full life, Keanu, she began. Movies, awards, a family, ups and downs. I've lost people, I've gained a lot, but there's always been this space in my heart, not a hole, just a quiet room that never got furnished, and I think I know it was yours. Keanu didn't move. His expression didn't change, but something inside him stilled. I don't know if it was timing, she continued, or fear, or fate just playing tricks. But all these years I've wondered what would have happened if I had just told you back then, that I loved you, not as a friend, not as a co-star, just loved you. The silence in the studio was complete. No laughter, no claps, not even the host knew what to say. Keanu's fingers gently tapped the couch, not nervous, processing. The camera caught the emotion rising behind his calm exterior like a tide rising against rock. Sandra, he finally said, voice low, breaking the tension like a prayer. I used to drive home from set every night and think about you. Every night, not just during speed, even during the years we didn't talk. When I saw you on TV or in a magazine, I'd wonder if you were okay, if you were happy. And I never told anyone this, but there were nights I'd sit in my car outside your gate just to feel near you. I never rang the bell, I just sat there. Gasps filled the audience. Sandra's hand went to her lips, trembling. You what? She breathed. I sat there, he repeated, because I didn't know how to knock. And just like that, something ancient and unfinished cracked open between them. Not for the show, not for the viewers, but for two souls who had waited far too long to finally meet, not as stars, but as people. Sandra reached for his hand. This time it was Keanu's turn to look stunned. She took it, not with drama, not with flair, just with the stillness of someone who knew finally that it was now or never. So I'm knocking now, she whispered. And I'm asking, can we talk, off camera, after this? Keanu didn't need time. He nodded once firmly, eyes glistening. The host, speechless, simply turned toward the camera and said, We'll be right back. But the world had already stopped breathing. The silence after the commercial break was not just felt in the studio, it radiated into living rooms across the world. Social media froze mid-scroll, comments halted mid-sentence, and newsrooms scrambled to rewrite their headlines. But inside that softly lit studio, Keanu and Sandra had already disappeared backstage, away from the cameras and the noise. No entourage, no PR handlers. Just the two of them in a narrow hallway with faded movie posters and forgotten echoes of laughter from past shows. For a moment, neither spoke. The air was thick, not with awkwardness, but with the gravity of 1,000 unsaid things finally taking shape. Sandra's heels clicked softly as she walked a few steps ahead, then stopped at a small dressing room with her name still glowing above the door. She looked back at him, not as a woman looking at a man, but as a soul checking if another was still willing to follow. Keanu stepped in behind her, closing the door gently, almost ceremonially. It was like shutting the past out, or perhaps finally letting it in. Inside, the room was small. A single mirror with light bulbs humming around its edges, a couch with a folded blanket, a tray with untouched fruit and sparkling water. Sandra sat down, letting the dress bunch around her knees, eyes staring at nothing. Keanu leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes locked on her, not with demand, not with defense, but with that same stillness that made people trust him without words. "I meant every word," she finally said, breaking the quiet. "It wasn't for the audience. It wasn't for a headline, it was for you." Keanu didn't nod, didn't flinch. "I know," he replied, "and I'm here not because the world was watching, but because I've been waiting for that moment since the day we wrapped Speed." That confession landed like thunder in a storm that had been quiet for far too long. She looked up slowly, studying his face. It hadn't changed much, perhaps a few lines, a touch of gray at the temple, but the same warmth lived in his eyes, that same unshakable calm. But now there was something else. Vulnerability, honesty, a hint of grief. "I used to dream," he continued, voice softer now, eyes unfocused like he was sifting through memories. "About Paris, about us walking by the river, no fans, no cameras, just you in a white coat and me trying to remember the French word for forever." Sandra smiled, heart aching. "Taugers." "Yeah," he said with a breath of awe, as if even the word itself carried too much meaning. "Taugers." The dressing room, for all its plainness, began to feel sacred. Like a place where time paused so truth could breathe. Sandra stood up slowly as if every step mattered now. She walked over to him and took both his hands. "Why didn't we ever talk about this, Keanu? Why did we let the years pile up like bricks between us?" He lowered his head. "Because I thought I wasn't enough for you. You were light and laughter and life, and I was grief and silence and shadows. I didn't want to pull you into my darkness." Her grip tightened. "You were never darkness. You were home. You were safe. You were the only real thing in a world that didn't stop spinning long enough for me to catch my breath." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, not as a fantasy, not as a what-if, but as the woman who just told the truth in front of the entire world and still wanted to say more. "Then maybe it's time," he whispered. "Time for what?" she asked, heart in her throat. "Time to stop pretending we missed our chance." That sentence broke something open inside her, not a sob, not a cry, but a deep, soul-level exhale of release. Years of pretending, of dodging questions, of saying, "We're just friends," all of it evaporated in that one breath. Keanu touched her cheek then, gently, reverently, as if he wasn't sure if this was a dream. "Can we try?" she asked, voice trembling. "Now, when the world already saw the truth in our eyes?" Keanu smiled, a crooked, boyish smile that she hadn't seen in decades. "Sandra, I've been ready since the moment you spilled coffee on my script on day one. You looked up at me, rolled your eyes, and said, 'Guess you'll have to memorize it the hard way.' And I did. I memorized every look you gave me, every laugh, every goodbye." Sandra leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest, his arms finally wrapping around her like a promise. No cameras, no applause, just two people who had waited half a lifetime to stop acting and start living. A knock came at the door, soft and respectful. A stage assistant's voice followed. "They're asking if you're coming back out." Sandra looked up at Keanu. "Should we?" He chuckled softly. "Let's make them wait a little longer. We've waited long enough." And as they stood there, holding each other in a quiet room backstage, the world outside could only guess. But the truth was no longer hidden. Two souls had finally spoken the language they were always fluent in, love, unspoken but unbreakable. The car ride away from the studio was quiet, but not uncomfortable. The silence between them wasn't awkward or heavy anymore. It was full of understanding, a gentle stillness that spoke more clearly than words. Sandra sat in the backseat beside Keanu, her hand loosely resting in his. The city outside moved like a blur, streetlights streaking through the window like silent fireworks, and neon signs reflecting softly on their faces. It had started to rain lightly, as if the sky was offering them a curtain, a moment of privacy from a world that would soon be asking questions. But for now, it was just them. Keanu turned his head slightly, studying her in the dim light. "You okay?" he asked, voice calm. Sandra looked at him, her expression tired but relieved. "I think I'm more than okay," she replied. "I think for the first time in a long time, I'm not pretending." The car stopped outside a quiet home in the hills, modest by Hollywood standards, but warm, inviting, alive with memories. It was Sandra's place, the one she'd retreated to when the world got too loud. Keanu had never been inside, though he'd driven by it before, always wondering what her life looked like behind those wooden gates. They stepped out together, the soft patter of rain brushing their shoulders as she led him to the door. Inside, the air smelled of vanilla and old books. A fireplace flickered low in the corner, casting gold against the hardwood floor. Photos lined the shelves, some of her children, some of her travels, and one or two of her smiling with old co-stars. None of Keanu, but that was about to change. She poured them both a cup of tea, not wine, not champagne, something warm and real. The clink of the mugs meeting was the only sound for a while as they sat on the couch, facing each other like two people meeting again for the very first time. "I didn't expect today to go the way it did," she confessed. I knew I had to say something. I couldn't carry it anymore, not when I've seen what happens when you wait too long." Keanu nodded, his gaze distant but deeply present. "I know. I've lost people too, people I thought I'd have more time with. And each time I did, I thought of you. I thought, what if you were one of them? What if you slipped away and I never said what I felt all along?" She reached for his hand again, and this time he held it like it was the last thing anchoring him to the moment. They began to talk, not like celebrities or icons, but like two souls finally laying down their armor. Keanu spoke about the loneliness that fame never fixed, about how he sometimes took long motorcycle rides at night just to feel real, to feel the wind and remember that the world was still turning even if his heart often felt stuck in time. Sandra listened, her eyes soft, never interrupting, just holding his truths like fragile porcelain. Then she shared her own fears, how she had built walls after loss, how she wore sarcasm like a shield, how every man who tried to love her had to compete with the ghost of the one she never admitted she loved. "That ghost," she whispered, "was you. Even when I was with someone else, it was your name that stayed in the silence." They stayed like that for hours, unfolding the years between them one memory at a time. He remembered the way she danced alone in her trailer when she thought no one was watching. She remembered how he always brought an extra coffee for the intern who was too scared to ask. He told her he kept the scarf she gave him on Christmas 1995. She told him she still played his voicemail from 2001 when she felt lost. It wasn't a night of fireworks. It wasn't a dramatic kiss. It was more sacred than that. It was healing. It was the slow, quiet mending of something torn before it ever fully began. As the night wore on, they found themselves on the floor in front of the fireplace, shoulders touching, laughter soft, stories spilling like rain on dry soil. Then there was a pause, a moment when they just looked at each other and everything unspoken felt like it had finally been said. Keanu reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Sandra," he said gently, "what if this is the start of our story, not the ending everyone thought we missed?" She looked into his eyes and for the first time didn't see the past. She saw everything that could still come. "Then let's write it," she whispered, "one page at a time." And as the fire burned low and dawn hinted at the horizon, two hearts that had spent decades searching finally found home, not in the flash of a spotlight, but in the quiet truth between them. The sunrise slipped quietly through the linen curtains, casting soft amber patterns onto the wooden floor where Keanu and Sandra had fallen asleep side by side. They hadn't intended to. There were no plans to stay, no assumptions made. But the hours had passed like seconds, and somewhere between shared laughter and old stories, time folded inward. Sandra woke first, blinking slowly at the golden light in the room and the comforting presence beside her. Her head rested lightly against Keanu's shoulder, his hand still holding hers, not tightly, not desperately, but like someone holding onto something they believed in. And for the first time in years, she didn't wake up with the familiar ache in her chest, the one that always whispered something was missing. Today, she felt full, whole, grounded. She didn't move, she just listened, to the quiet, to his breathing, to the truth of how easy it felt now, how natural it was to exist with him in this silence. And then, as if his body recognized her stillness, Keanu stirred. His eyes opened slowly, a little dazed at first, but then softened when he saw her looking at him. "Morning," he said, voice hoarse from sleep. "Morning," she replied with a gentle smile. He shifted slightly but didn't let go of her hand. "Didn't mean to stay the night." "I'm glad you did," she whispered. "No one has ever stayed without asking for something in return." Keanu looked at her, and in that moment, there was a tenderness in his expression that no camera had ever caught. Then maybe it's time someone stayed just to stay. They got up slowly, moving like two people learning how to walk inside a new chapter. Sandra brewed coffee in the kitchen while Keanu leaned against the counter, watching her. She looked beautiful in her oversized cardigan, hair a little wild, eyes a little puffy, but all the more radiant for it. "You always looked like this in my head," he said suddenly. She turned, confused. "Like what?" "Like this, morning light, real, unedited." She paused, taking that in, her heart warming with the kind of sincerity that couldn't be scripted. "Well, you," she replied, pouring his cup, "always looked like someone who knew how to make silence feel safe." They sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming between them, coffee in hand, hearts open. "Can I tell you something?" she asked, her voice soft, hesitant. "Of course. For years, I convinced myself I didn't deserve the kind of love you gave me, not because of anything you did, but because I didn't know how to accept it. I was always performing, for the world, for the men I dated, even for myself, but you saw through all that, and it scared me, because I knew you'd love the real me. And I didn't think the real me was worth it." Keanu set down his coffee. "Sandra," he said with deliberate calm, "you were always worth it, always, even when you disappeared for years, even when I heard about your losses and I wasn't there, even when I told myself to move on, you were always the one." She blinked back the tears that had crept up without warning, her breath catching in her throat. "And you? You were my quiet anchor. I watched your interviews, read between your silences, and every time they asked you about love, you'd give that same answer, about keeping it private, about not needing to speak it aloud. But I heard it. I heard the parts meant for me." He reached across the table and took her hand again, that steady hand that had once carried grief and now carried the possibility of something beautiful. "Then let's stop missing each other in silence," he said. "Let's speak it. Let's live it." Later that afternoon, they stepped outside together, walking down the narrow trail behind her house that led into a small, forgotten garden she hadn't touched in years. The wind rustled through the trees gently as if welcoming them. "I used to come here and talk to you," she said. "When you weren't there, I'd sit on that bench and ask, what would Keanu say right now? And even when I didn't get an answer, I felt better." He looked at the bench, then at her. "You know what I would have said?" She raised an eyebrow. "What? I would have said, let's plant something we can both watch grow." She laughed, heart swelling. "You and your metaphors." He knelt down and pulled off a pair of gloves from a nearby gardening box. "Not a metaphor this time." They spent hours in the garden. No stylists, no camera crews, just dirt under their nails and light in their eyes. Keanu planted a lavender bush. Sandra chose sunflowers. They laughed about how neither of them knew what they were doing. But it wasn't about the plants. It was about finally putting roots down together. A single afternoon, a small garden. A symbolic act that felt like destiny finally catching up. As evening fell and they stood side by side watching the golden petals catch the last rays of the sun, Sandra leaned her head on Keanu's shoulder. "Do you think we're too late?" she asked softly. Keanu shook his head. "No, the best stories don't rush. They arrive right on time." And as the sky turned violet and the first stars blinked into view, two hearts that had spent a lifetime in parallel finally began writing their first chapter. Out loud together, and with no more need for silence. The following weeks unfolded like the quiet pages of a long-lost novel, chapters neither of them expected to read so late in life, yet every word felt like it had been waiting patiently to be lived. Sandra found herself smiling for no reason in the mornings, brewing 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, humming as she folded laundry that suddenly didn't feel like a chore anymore. Keanu, who had always found comfort in solitude, now lingered longer in every shared room. There was no rush. No public statements. They hadn't made any announcements or changed their status on some screen, but something in the way they existed together had changed. Not the kind of change that demands attention, but the kind that roots itself quietly in the soul. The kind that made the quiet feel rich and full. Sometimes he stayed over, sometimes he didn't. There was no pressure. They had already lived lives full of contracts and scripts and expectations. What they had now was freedom, freedom to finally love without performing it. One rainy afternoon, Keanu found an old scrapbook buried in the back of Sandra's closet. She kept it sealed in a velvet box, something she hadn't opened in years. He sat on the floor beside her as she peeled it open, page by page. Movie stills. Behind-the-scenes Polaroids, newspaper clippings, fan letters, photos from sets they had shared, including Speed, a time that now felt like the beginning of something that had taken decades to bloom. She laughed at the notes she'd scribbled in the margins, at her own handwriting, at the memories she thought she'd forgotten. Then came the page that made her pause. It was a photo of them, young, vibrant, caught mid-laugh during a break in filming. She was tugging on his sleeve, and he was looking at her like she was the only thing in the world. Sandra traced her fingers along the edge of the picture. "I used to stare at this photo," she admitted, "and imagine what would have happened if I'd just turned to you that day and said how I felt." Keanu didn't speak. He just watched her. And after a long breath, he leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. "You just did," he whispered, "and I'm here, I never left." As days turned into weeks, something beautiful unfolded, not loud, not flashy, but real. They went grocery shopping together like normal people. They took long walks in parks where strangers did double takes but didn't bother them. They cooked together, burned pancakes, and watched old movies they both pretended to have seen just to impress each other in interviews long ago. Sandra's son, Louis, had met Keanu before, but now it was different. Now Keanu wasn't just the kind actor from the movies. He was the quiet man who knelt down to help with homework, who taught him how to change a bike chain, who listened more than he spoke. Louis had once asked Sandra casually, "Is he staying this time?" And Sandra, with eyes soft and full, had answered, "I hope so, sweetheart. I really hope so." One evening, they hosted a small dinner at Sandra's place. Just a few close friends, some wine, candles flickering. They weren't making an announcement. They weren't planning anything dramatic. But when someone asked, "So what's happening between you two?" Keanu reached across the table and gently took Sandra's hand. He didn't make a speech. He just said, "We stopped missing each other." That was all, and somehow that was enough. Enough to make even the loudest voices fall silent. Enough to say everything. Still, there were moments of fear. Late at night when the world went quiet and the weight of what they'd missed haunted them like shadows across the ceiling. Sandra sometimes woke in a sweat, heart racing, afraid it might all disappear, that this too was a beautiful dream she didn't deserve to keep. Keanu would hold her then in complete stillness and whisper the same phrase over and over. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." And he meant it, every single time. One particular night, after watching an old movie they had both starred in but never revisited, Sandra turned to him with a tearful smile. "You know what's strange?" she said. "We've been telling stories all our lives, playing lovers, playing heartbreak, playing happiness, but this feels like the first time I'm not acting." Keanu pulled her close and rested his chin on her head. "That's because this is the story we were meant to write, not the one the world cast us in." And just like that, something shifted again, not in the world, not in the press, not online, but inside them. The kind of shift that makes you exhale and realize you've been holding your breath for 20 years. They didn't need public approval. They didn't need to trend. They had each other, finally, after everything, after loss, after grief, after fame and its echo, after time itself. The garden they had planted weeks ago had begun to bloom, clumsy, imperfect, but defiantly alive. Lavender swayed in the breeze, and the sunflowers stood tall like golden sentinels of second chances. They stood there one morning, hand in hand, the earth still damp beneath their feet. "Do you ever regret anything?" she asked him softly. "Only that we didn't get here sooner," he said. "But maybe we wouldn't have been ready. Maybe now is the only time we could have truly held it." Sandra looked at him, the man who had waited, who had watched, who had loved her in silence for decades. "Then let's not waste a second more," she said, tears catching in her lashes. Keanu nodded. "We won't." And as the wind moved through the garden and the sun climbed higher in the sky, two hearts that had lived too long in separate chapters finally stood on the same page, ready to begin the final act. One not written by fame or fear or time, but by truth, pure, unshakable truth. Autumn crept slowly over Los Angeles, brushing its fingertips across the hills and casting amber fire into the trees behind Sandra's home. The city, so often obsessed with the artificial, billboards, premieres, and the next big thing, seemed to pause, if only for a moment, to acknowledge something rare blooming quietly behind its noise. A love story not manufactured by scripts or headlines, but by time, regret, courage, and truth. Sandra and Keanu had stopped counting days. They no longer measured time in interviews or projects. Theirs was a rhythm found in shared dinners, morning coffees, garden walks, and unplanned silences that somehow felt like prayers. The garden they once thought was symbolic had now become a living, breathing testament to everything they never got to say. Until now. One Saturday afternoon, Keanu stood alone by the garden, a small notebook in his hand. He had never been the kind to journal, but since that night backstage, he had started writing. Not poems, not essays, just moments, memories he'd hidden in the corners of his heart for too long. On this page, he was writing something different. A vow. Not the kind exchanged beneath stained glass or in front of a crowd, but a silent promise spoken between two people who had already lived through enough to know that real vows are made in how you show up day after day. He wrote slowly, deliberately. "I won't promise you the world, Sandra. I'll promise you presence. I'll promise you peace. I'll promise to love you even in the quiet, even when the world isn't watching." She watched him from the kitchen window, heart swelling with a kind of calm joy she never thought she'd feel again. Sandra had always been strong. She had endured loss, public scrutiny, betrayal, and the loneliness of a woman expected to hold everything together. But now, in this life with this man, she no longer had to be strong alone. That evening, she invited a few friends over, not for a party, but something quieter, intimate. A dinner, candles lit, homemade food on mismatched plates, and laughter echoing between the walls that once held nothing but silence. Louis played the piano softly in the background, while Keanu sat beside Sandra, his hand resting gently on her thigh beneath the table, a simple gesture that anchored her like the weight of truth. After dessert, the room stilled, and Sandra stood up with her glass in hand. "I wasn't planning to say anything," she began, voice slightly trembling, "but I need to." She turned to Keanu, who looked up at her with soft eyes, the kind that held galaxies and patience and memories of decades past. "You once told me that love doesn't need to be loud to be real," she said. "That sometimes it's in the quietest moments that it speaks loudest. I didn't understand that back then. I was chasing fireworks, grand gestures, answers I didn't need. But you were always there. The quiet, the calm, the constant, and I almost missed it. I almost missed you." Keanu stood beside her now, not out of formality, but because something in him couldn't stay seated any longer. "You never missed me," he said gently. "You were just gathering the courage to see me." The room fell into a reverent hush. No applause, no clinking glasses, just a moment where the entire world narrowed down to two people finally arriving at the place they were always meant to be. And then, without spectacle or script, Keanu pulled a small ring from his pocket. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't covered in diamonds. It was vintage, simple, elegant, like their story. "I don't need a stage," he said softly. "I just need you, all of you, and I want to spend the rest of my life reminding you that I was always just one step behind, waiting." Tears ran freely down Sandra's cheeks, not from surprise, but from the peace of something finally aligning. She nodded, unable to speak, but her heart screamed yes 1,000 times over. He slipped the ring on her finger, and they embraced, not like a fairy tale, but like a reunion of two parts of the same soul that had finally made their way home. They didn't announce it to the press. There were no headlines, no interviews, no flashy PR strategy. A few weeks later, in a hidden corner of Napa Valley, surrounded by a handful of people who mattered and the gentle hush of wind through vineyards, they exchanged vows beneath a willow tree. Keanu wore a charcoal gray suit with his hair tucked behind his ears. Sandra wore a soft, flowing dress, barefoot in the grass, laughter in her eyes. Louis stood between them, holding the rings. There was no priest. No paparazzi, just love, pure, present, unshaken. After the ceremony, they didn't throw a big party. They danced barefoot under fairy lights in the backyard of a small inn, music playing from an old speaker, the stars their only guests. As they swayed together, forehead to forehead, Sandra whispered, "Do you think people will believe this is real?" Keanu smiled against her skin. "Let them wonder, this is ours." And in the days that followed, the world did wonder. Rumors swirled, photos leaked, but neither of them offered statements. Love, they knew now, didn't need to prove itself. Their silence was not avoidance, it was reverence. A vow between them, stronger than any headline could ever hold. Years passed and their story became something of a legend, the quiet love story that bloomed off-screen, the truth behind all the old photos, the bond that outlived gossip, time, and the noise of Hollywood. And for those who truly listened, who really watched that night when Sandra Bullock sat beside Keanu Reeves on live TV and said, "Can I say something real?" they understood. That moment wasn't just entertainment. It was a beginning, a reckoning. A reckoning with all the things we bury, all the truths we hesitate to say out loud, until it's almost too late. But for Keanu and Sandra, it wasn't too late. Not anymore. They walked through every season together after that, grief, joy, aging, laughter, the soft fading of spotlight, never letting go, never losing sight of the quiet love that had waited patiently all their lives. And in the end, it wasn't the fame or the roles or the awards that defined them. It was the garden that bloomed behind their home. The mornings spent barefoot on a wooden porch, the coffee shared in silence, the old piano in the hallway, the laughter that spilled without reason, the eyes that finally saw and never looked away again. It was love, real, quiet, unshakable.